Hello everyone and welcome back to The Games Must Go On, a series where when the going gets tough, the tough get really frustrated because they've spent hours on a single level. Today I'm going to be tackling New Super Mario Bros Wii without power-ups and without jumping. So let's get right into this. The rules here are pretty simple. In terms of Itemless, I'm going to be banning everything from the item menu on the world map. Everything else is fair game, however, and that does include things like propeller blocks, Yoshi, and even checkpoints, which might sound especially dubious since they give you a super mushroom effect. However, I'm allowing them because I don't want to have to waste time replaying stuff that I've already done over and over again. So, yeah, checkpoints are allowed, and for a very similar reason, I'm going to be giving myself a pseudo checkpoint whenever I reach a boss door. Nevertheless, let's move on to Jumpless, which also has a very simple rule set. That being no jumping, no spin jumping, no wall jumping, and no jumping at the surface of water. The only things I can see getting mixed up with jumping that actually aren't are bouncing off of other players and enemies, and swimming. Both of these actions are perfectly allowed. And with that, the only other thing I want to mention are that secret exits are banned. Other than that though, let's hop right into the run. In 1-1, we have kind of a problem. That being, in my original Jumpless run, I allowed the propeller mushroom, which basically bypassed any possible problem that I could have had. Hence why I'm doing this run in the first place. Now, without the propeller mushroom, obviously we have a problem. That being, we have no way of getting any vertical height whatsoever. Or at least that's what I would say if my original run hadn't also found a different way of getting vertical height. That being by using multiplayer. You see, whenever you have two players, you can press the A button and then shake your remote to bubble a player and then bring them to the other one. And after they reach the other player, they'll actually pop out of their bubble, giving them a decent amount of height. Now this was the jump replacement I used originally to reach the propeller mushroom. However, now it's our only option, and it's what I'm going to be using for the vast majority of the game. But can it really even get past the first level? Well, it actually can. However, it's definitely a little weird to get used to the new controls. That's because I decided the best way to hold the Wii remotes was vertically with one in each hand, or as I've been calling it, the Wii Dualies. Holding the remotes like this has some pretty big benefits, the biggest of which being independent control over both players. This is pretty important because if I shake the remote of a player that's in a bubble, that bubble will move towards the other player. However, if I shake the remote of a player who's on the ground, they'll end up doing a spin jump, which is obviously not allowed. So having independent control of this is really important. It does have its disadvantages though. For one, because I'm holding the Wii remotes vertically, it's a little disorienting because now I have to press up and down to move left and right. Also, because of the way I'm holding the remote, I have my thumb on the D-pad and A button. However, I don't have any fingers that I can put on the 2 and 1 buttons, which means I'm going to be walking for the vast majority of the run. Now, obviously that's what the 1 button does, but not having the 2 button doesn't sound that bad. However, it does have its own drawbacks, mostly when it comes to being able to bounce off of other players and by bouncing off of enemies, as by holding the 2 button there, I can get a significant more amount of height. But we'll cross those problems when they become an issue. For now, 1-1, 1-2, and 1-3 all serve as pretty easy tutorials to learn the controls of this run. But then we reach 1-Tower, which is where the real challenge begins and where I would like to officially ask the question, can you beat a new Super Mario Bros. Wii without items and without jumping? Let's go! One Dash Tower is our first real level in the run, and oh boy, it is definitely a level. Its first section is pretty difficult on its own, where we have to go ahead and get up a couple of moving platforms while dealing with dry bones. And oh boy, dry bones are definitely not an enemy that I like to be seeing this early. You see, dry bones, after they die, come back to life, which means we can't get rid of them. These guys are a constant nuisance. Thankfully, I did find one way to manage them. By going ahead and killing them once, you can go ahead and repeatedly bounce on a player's head in order to kill them before they actually respawn. However, this doesn't answer the problem of the moving platforms, as we're just a little bit too slow to get up them normally. This difficult problem actually has a really simple solution, that being just don't use the moving platforms. No one can make you. Instead, go ahead and grab a third controller and then stack all 3 players on top of each other. This will continue to kill the dry bones, and then you can go ahead and by focusing all of your energy on just timing 2 presses instead of on the D-pad, you can go ahead and get some massive vertical height, skipping this section entirely. However, the fact that we have to use free player on level 4 definitely doesn't bode well for the rest of a run. But we're not out of the tower yet. That was the first section. Now let's go ahead and move a little higher up, and now we have an even taller crushing section. However, this one's kind of a farce, as while I've spent a bunch of time trying to clear it, it was a complete waste of time as there's actually a second way you can go, that being just through the ceiling over here where a star coin is, which allows me to get up much more easily and allows us to get to the checkpoint. Thankfully, it doesn't get much harder from here. Just kidding, now we have an even larger crushing section! Unfortunately, we aren't able to just breeze past this section like the last couple. Instead, we're going to have to work a little bit smarter. Now, my first idea was to stack all 3 players on top of each other in order to get some massive vertical height, but due to how low the crushers are in this section, I ended up just getting crushed or just not having enough space to continue bouncing. However, we do have enough space to continue bouncing with 2 players, and that's all we really need to take full advantage of the Luigi springboard. What I found works is by sending the 3rd player up in a bubble, up right above the players that are bouncing, I can go ahead and use the Luigi springboard while the crushers are open to pop the 3rd player out of their bubble so they can land on top of the crushers. After that, all we need to do is just bubble another player and get them up to Yellow Toad quickly, and by doing that we can get on top of this ledge, which is pretty easy to stall on. And with that, we're able to get up to the semi-solid and make our way to Larry. As for the fight itself, it's actually pretty easy, as we have an overpowered technique on our side, that being iframes. Whenever we pop out of a bubble, we have a few seconds where we're completely intangible, and this is incredibly powerful when dealing with enemies, especially the Koopaling bosses, as they have to come to us and then we can just trample them without having any fear of dying ourselves. It isn't a foolproof strategy, as if we get unlucky with the bubbles, they can drift away and we might lose our invincibility, but for the most part it makes these fights cakewalks. As for Larry's fight itself, I didn't actually abuse iframes all that much. Instead, I opted for putting Mario on the very edge of a platform where he wouldn't be hit by Larry's shell attack. And this worked pretty well as I could attack with other characters. However, he did end up dying, but I actually got really lucky as Luigi was able to finish him off without even needing to bubble. So yeah, Larry is down and we're able to move on from 1- Tower. Next up is 1-4, which is a really nice water level, or at least it is until we get to the very end where we have to exit the water by jumping out of it in order to reach the exit pipe. That is obviously banned. However, what is jumping at the surface of water? Now my rules are essentially that if I press the 2 button to exit the water, that is banned. However, there's other ways to exit the water besides pressing the 2 button. Mainly, I just need to have enough vertical velocity, and we have a really easy way of getting vertical velocity here. That is, just by popping out of a bubble. And in fact, by popping out of a bubble right near the surface of water, we can actually simulate a jump without even pressing the 2 button. And with that, we're able to clear 1-4. Or at least, that's what I would say if these purple cheap cheeps weren't here. These guys are actually really annoying because once we get close to them, they'll start to home in on us, which is kind of a problem because we need to sit still for a few seconds in order to set up the bubble trick. Thankfully, they are fish, which means they will fall for bait, which means it's time to get a nice lure. And what do you know, Luigi and Mario make some pretty tasty snacks. So we'll go ahead and lure them over to the left and then like way further, and then we'll just get them off screen to unload them. Now with the fish gone, we can get out of the water and complete the level. Next up, we have our first enemy blockade, and like every enemy blockade after it, this one is pretty easy. However, after we beat it, we go ahead and move on to 1-6, which is a little bit more tricky, as the rolling hills here are actually a little difficult to get the hang of, but I was able to manage at least until I got to this one that has a pipe spewing Goombas on it. Here, I decided to use a Luigi springboard to bounce off of Luigi and then off of a Goomba to land on this block. After that, we can get to the end, however, the last few rolling hills are kind of janky, as you can clearly see Mario is great at rock climbing a 90-degree surface. Either way, the level is definitely possible, and we can move on to 1-Castle. This level definitely ups the ante on the difficulty of this run. Now, there isn't anything here that seems especially impossible per se, as it's mostly just platforming over moving gears, but the fact that we have to run on gears is a huge problem for this run, as it exploits our second biggest weakness right after quick time moving platforms, that being the bubble mechanics themselves. To be specific, the problem with the bubble mechanics is what happens when a bubble player touches you when they're in a wall. Now normally when they're not in a wall, they'll just immediately pop out of a bubble, which is going to make them much more responsive. However, when they're in a wall, obviously the developers don't want them to spawn in a wall, so they go ahead and make the bubble move towards where you are. But what happens if you're on a moving platform like, oh, I don't know, let's say a gear? Well, then it's going to go ahead and try to track their bubble over to where you were. However, that causes a problem because you're moving. Now where you were isn't where you are. However, where you were is where the gear is. So now the player in the bubble is still inside of a wall, and as such they can't pop out of their bubble. This causes a problem because now they'll just stay stuck in the gear for an extended amount of time. And when you're stuck on a gear, you don't really have time to waste, as you'll never guess, but lava tends to be slightly above room temperature, causing slight burns when you touch it. So obviously, we don't have time to waste on the players trying to figure out that they're actually in a wall, and that's typically seen as bad. So yeah, that makes this level significantly more difficult. However, after about 6 hours, I got lucky with the bubble mechanics and was able to beat it, as not even the thwomps could stand in my way. And now we're off to World 2. In comparison to World 1, World 2 is significantly easier, and that can even be seen in the first couple of levels I took down, that being 2-2 and 2-3, as both can be beaten pretty easily with patience. That doesn't mean every level is a pushover though, as 2-Tower definitely puts up a fight. Now for one, we have to deal with fences that we can climb on. However, these fences are climbed on with up and down, and if you remember, I'm holding these Wii remotes vertically, which definitely makes climbing really disorienting. However, it doesn't throw that much of a wrench in our plans. What does throw a wrench in my plans though is the fact that the bubble tracking is incredibly terrible in this level. What I'm referring to here as bubble tracking is actually what happens when you initially form the bubble. Now in a normal level, what will happen is the bubble will drift down a little bit, it might swoop back up, it'll head towards the other player. However, in a tower level, that isn't going to happen. Instead, the bubble will actually move straight up or down initially, which means you basically always have to shake the remote in order to pop out of a bubble. And basically anytime you try to bubble, it's going to take longer to get the bubble towards you than it would on a normal level. This makes it really annoying to climb up quick time events like, oh, I don't know, these fences that are moving in and out of a wall. It doesn't make it impossible, and we are still able to make it all the way up, even with Roy shooting at us, but it's definitely more annoying than if it was just a normal bubbling feature. Either way, after destroying Roy, we're able to move on to 2-4, where the wind actually helps like 90% of the time and it's a very easy level. Next is 2-6, which you might think would be pretty difficult because we have to stay on a rotating cube the entire time, but we don't really have to worry about bubbling because there's not really any obstacles that are just in our way. Most of them are moving up and down or back and forth, which means we can just go over them by abusing the sides of the cube. So yeah, it's actually a pretty easy level. After that, though, we're on to 2-Castle. First of all, let me just say that this castle is significantly easier than the one in World 1. Then again, that's not much of an accomplishment considering what World 1's castle actually was. That doesn't mean that this is a pushover though, as it does have its own challenges. First of all, this is a maze castle where it's an auto-scroller that we have to go down the right path. However, that's not really an issue until we get to the third section, where we're supposed to hit a P-switch before going through the middle path that's blocked off with blocks normally that turn into coins. This is pretty difficult because we have the time limit of the P-switch, plus the room is moving pretty fast. There is definitely a solution though, that being to use the dry bones that fall down a level when you hit the P-switch. These guys make great bounce pads, and by using them we can make our way all the way over to where the coins are and go fight Roy, who is of course pretty easy. And with that, we're on to World 3. World 3 starts off deceptively easy, with 3-1 and 3-2 basically being pushovers, but then we reach 3-Tower. Now the first half of the level is relatively easy, just go across some rotating platforms and survive this elevator ride, but then we reach the second half of the level. The main gimmick of this section is that we're on a platform that rises up and picks up tons of dry bones. Now this wouldn't be that big of a deal on its own, as we can just abuse iframes to just survive in a sea of dry bones. However, because this is a rising platform and this is a tower level, the bubble physics are just so terrible you cannot stall in this level. That causes some problems, but it's not the end of the world. The strategy that I found that works the best is to go ahead and put your Luigi springboard about in the middle. Not exactly in the middle, but close to it. Then go ahead and bounce Mario on said Luigi springboard. We're going to be using this as a base of operations for right now. Now as dry bones start to approach Luigi, go ahead and bounce on their heads. Wait until this POW block starts to get low, and once it does, land on it. Now your first idea might be, oh boy, you have a POW block. That's an actual weapon, you might be able to survive. However, using the POW block would be my greatest mistake. That's why instead I recommend actually standing on it, as this prevents any dry bones from attacking you from the sides. Unfortunately, Nintendo knew about this cheese and decided to also put some dry bones above you. However, we have a second character to take care of them. Go ahead and bounce Luigi on Mario's head or vice versa and try to land on them to take them out. If you're lucky, you should be able to stop them from actually landing on the POW block. However, if they do, you're basically done for. You have to stall here for quite a while until you see these spike balls. Once you do, go ahead and try to bounce on some dry bones to get over them. After we get over the spike balls, we're basically home free, as the spike balls will actually roll in and hit the POW block, destroying everything on screen, which is really great for us. After that, all we have to deal with are some more dry bones and some more spike balls. Thankfully, there's a lot less happening now, so we can just use iframes to deal with it. While we can't stall indefinitely, we really just have to go through the spike balls and we'll be alright. After they collide with another POW block that appears, we're basically at the gate. We just have to go across some more rotating platforms, and now we're fighting Lemmy. Surprisingly, Lemmy is actually the second hardest boss in the entire game. No, I am not joking, and that's simply because Lemmy's attacks don't go through us with iframes like every other Koopalings. Instead, whenever Lemmy attacks, his bouncy balls will actually push us, and because we can't jump over them, that actually makes him quite hazardous. Not to mention, after Lemmy attacks, he'll roll to the other side of the stage, which isn't great for us. I was still able to do it after a few attempts, but Lemmy is definitely not an easy boss for this run. Hey, we only have one more level before Free Dash Castle, that being Free Dash 4, which I'm sure will be a nice, easy level. And by easy, I mean it is both figuratively and literally impossible. I wish I was joking about this, but the obstacle we face is literally moving platforms that are sliding incredibly fast that we're supposed to jump across. It isn't great for the Jumpless challenge in more than one ways. For one, it's quick platforming, which is bad enough on its own, but the fact that the walls are sliding, it brings back memories of One Dash Castle, and how if a player bubbles inside of a wall, when they hit the other player, they'll still get stuck in the wall. Yeah, this obstacle is basically the absolute perfection of this problem. However, that's not even the main issue with this level. The problem is, even if we beat this section, it would take us to a secret exit, which would then bring us to 3-5, which we could then clear to go to hit a red switch. That would activate all the red blocks in 3-4, including some that let us get in this red pipe, which takes us to the regular exit, bringing us to 3-Castle. The problem is it still requires us to use the secret exit in this level. So we actually need to find a way to enter the red pipe without the red switch hit, which has its own problems considering we need ground in order to enter the pipe, and without the red switch, we have no ground. The challenge isn't over yet though, as we do have one option for replacement ground, that being these ice blocks that you can pick up and carry, as well as that you can stand on. This means if we could get a player carrying one of these ice blocks right underneath the pipe with another player on top of them, we could actually enter the pipe. However, saying that is a lot easier said than done considering this overhang, which is by level design. That isn't going to stop me though, as well, it definitely looks a little less than humanly possible. I have one option at my disposal, that being TAS or Tool Assisted Speedruns. By being able to go frame by frame and control 4 players simultaneously, I can do some pretty crazy things that obviously are less likely to be done by a human. Like this. Yeah, this is kind of crazy. However, I'm going to really try to avoid using TAS in this run. However, when it comes down to it, in sections like these, I want to prove what's actually possible. Nevertheless, let's move on to 3-Castle, because I'm sure it will be much easier, and by that I mean it's a snake block level that has ice physics, with platforming that falls down from the sky, which we must do very quickly. I'm sure this could never go wrong. I will say, after a while, I did get pretty good at managing the snake blocks. However, there is this section with 4 icicles that we're supposed to jump between that is still incredibly difficult, and I probably wouldn't be able to do it legit if it wasn't for a small technique that I picked up, that being full throttle. At the beginning of a run, I mentioned that I wasn't able to hold the 1 button simply because of how I was holding the remotes. Now, that still is sort of true. I can't hold it with any of my fingers. But who said I had to? Full throttle essentially says, just slam the side of your hand into the remote and hope everything works out, as it has a decent chance of hitting the 1 button, and if it does, great, I can move faster. And by doing that while on the second icicle, we can basically skip the third icicle and land right in this little crevice next to the 4th icicle. And that is the only shot that we have at actually clearing the section. After a few hours, I was able to pull it off. However, we're not out of the castle yet. Instead, now we have the second half of the castle, which is another snake block. Great! Well, at least this one focuses more on moving vertically, which means we can just stand on the front of a snake block, and it's not as bad. However, the last part where we have to continuously loop upwards, that is a little difficult, not gonna lie. But I was able to pull it off, and now we have the boss fight with Lemmy, which is of course even harder than last time. However, just like last time, we can go ahead and bounce up with a second player, and that allows us to defeat Lemmy and move on. World 4 starts off with 4-1, and it's basically the opposite of 1-4. Now 1-4 was a nice little water level where we had to get out of the water at the very end by luring some purple Cheep Cheeps out of the way. World 4-1 is basically the opposite because the entire level is all about luring purple cheep cheep so you can get out of the water. And oh boy, you have to do it a bunch. But it's never as complicated as it was in 1-4 and never as big of a deal. So I was able to do it pretty easily. Next up is 4-3, where the only thing we have to worry about is using some iframes to go through a large urchin at the end, but besides that it's pretty easy. However, next we have 4-Tower, and like towers before it, it sucks, but just mostly because of the bubble physics, as the main gimmick of the tower are some conveyor belts that move metal boxes, which would normally be really annoying, but since they move so slow, and you have so many safe spots, it's really not as bad. It still sucks, but it's not as bad, so with that we can take down Wendy and move right along. For once, the game actually gives us a pretty substantial break, as 4-4, 4-Ghost House, 4-5, and 4-Castle are all pretty easy. Yeah, even a castle isn't that difficult. However, 4-A does have a couple of little issues. For one, we have to use iframes to get through some bombs, but then we run into some propeller blocks right before the boss. Now, in my rules, I did allow propeller blocks because, well, they aren't power-ups. However, in the spirit of the challenge, I decided to add a little bonus rule, that being I could only use propeller blocks while off of the ground. That's because it's just more fun that way. However, that does mean we actually have to use a Luigi springboard to use the propeller blocks that are in this room. And then we get into the Bowser Jr. fight itself, and of course we are supposed to use propeller blocks there as well. However, by going ahead and using Luigi springboards while on top of a propeller block, we can actually get enough height to hit Bowser Jr. without needing them in the first place. And with that, we're done with World 4, so let's move on to World 5. World 5 starts out pretty much like every other world, that being pretty easily in 5-1 and 5-2. The only thing to note is that in 5-1, the vines are a little bit tricky because I decided to ban jumping off of them because, like, come on. Now, that does make them a little bit more difficult to manage because you have to use bubbles to get off of them, but it's nothing I can't handle, and we're able to move right along the 5-Tower. This level has a very terrible gimmick for this run. That being, the walls move back and forth, and you're supposed to be able to do platforming on the sides while they're retracted. Yeah, quick platforming ain't gonna happen. Now I will say that I was able to get up through the first half by using some really careful Luigi springboards and doing some okay platforming. However, if the walls get any faster, I'm doomed. Anyway, welcome to the second section where the walls are much faster and basically all the platforming is on the sides with absolutely no safe spots. Yeah, this isn't gonna happen. Or at least that's what I would say if I didn't have a way to beat this section. But what do you know, I did figure something out. That being to literally just fly because why not? Now, the way that I figured this out is to first go ahead and bubble one player and then pop them out on the other player's head. By doing this, I can immediately bubble with the other player, and then by the time the other player falls, the other player actually has gotten some height in their bubble. Then they get popped out, you immediately bubble with the other player, and you sort of repeat doing this. And by doing that, you can actually get perpetual height. However, just saying that isn't really putting in perspective how finicky this is. For starters, this trick can only be done in towers because when you bubble in a tower, you move straight up or down, depending on where the camera is, and with this trick you're always going to be moving up. However, this can also only be done in an area where you have open space, like in this area where the walls don't actually interact with the middle. And hey, what do you know? There's literally nothing in the middle, hence why there was no safe spots. Even with the right conditions though, you can still fail, simply because the bubbles have a mind of their own and can often just go in the wrong direction and end up missing. Or you can just land directly on the other player's head, which will end up initiating a bounce, which if you bubble the wrong player will send you skyrocketing right back down into the ground. In my opinion, this is a very difficult trick to do simply because there's so much luck involved, and it feels like even if the pH of your controller is wrong by a single digit, it's gonna fail. But hey, with this trick in hand, we can at least beat this section, and then we get into a way harder section where the walls move all the way from side to side. Unfortunately, I don't have a way of beating this level. The flying trick is way too finicky to work here, And just doing fancy footwork ain't gonna happen because the walls move way too fast. So yeah, unfortunately this isn't going to happen, and I'm not just giving you a fake out this time. Well, I am, because it's not going to happen by a human. However, a task doesn't care about how finicky a trick can work, it will make it work. And because I can focus more on things like shaking in midair to stall for time, I can actually use a task to make my way all the way to the top of a tower. And that leads us to Iggy, who is actually really easy and he goes down without much of a fight. Next up is 5-4, which is actually really similar to 3-Tower, as we have to survive on a raft while enemies rain down from the sky. And it doesn't help that iframe stalling doesn't really work here since we're on a moving platform, meaning we're going to be drifting back if we continuously pop out of bubbles. However, I was actually able to beat it with some difficulty. But I would like to mention one other little detail, and that is Micro Goombas are the second worst enemy for this run. Now you might be thinking, oh, that's a funny joke, but I'm actually being serious because Micro Goombas remove your ability to bubble. They're like the one enemy that actually does this, and in order to get rid of Micro Goombas once you get them, you just have to take a nice lovely bath in some delicious poison. After that, we're able to easily take down 5-Ghost House before moving on to 5-Castle. And it really wasn't that bad. Even though it's a long level and the fences are kind of annoying, nothing really happened here. Even Iggy's shots, which were kind of annoying in their own right, weren't that big of a problem because they often aimed too high to hit us and they really weren't much of a threat. So yeah, 5-Castle goes down and we're able to move on to World 6. To be completely honest, World 6 might be the easiest one so far, as I was able to beat 6-1 on my first try, I was able to beat 6-3 after popping out of a bubble to leave the water at the very end, and 6-Tower, while the skewer is kind of annoying, we can just stand on the sides to avoid taking damage. After that, it doesn't get much harder, as in 6-5, while there is an annoying Porcupuffer, it's manageable if you use iframes and take it slowly. Heck, for the second half of a level, you get a propeller block to make it even easier. For 6-6, you can just swim underneath the entire level, and for 6-Castle, you can just use iframes to deal with the spiky boulders, and the platforming isn't too bad on the swings. After that, all we have is 6-Airship, which, while there are some rotating platforms and they're a little tricky, nothing really is that difficult, so we're able to move right along to World 7. I hope you haven't fallen into a false sense of security from World 6, because World 7 is definitely difficult. Now I know what you're thinking, okay, so just get to the tower and castle and skip everything else. But surprisingly, World 7 is different, as the difficulty comes from 7-1, 7-2, and 7-3. So let's get right into it. Starting off with 7-1, the problem here comes from one particular section, where we have to get past this red block and go to this green block, and we have to do it with a Luigi springboard. Now, that would be hard enough on a moving platform, but it's a little bit more frustrating because the green block is on a different cycle as the red one, which means you could have everything perfectly set up, but just get bad luck. But overall, it definitely is doable and we can move on to 7-2. This level's whole gimmick is water bubbles that we're supposed to be jumping in and out of in order to platform. That's kind of a problem because in order to jump out of a water bubble, we need to be treading water really close to the surface so that way the bubbled player can actually exit the water. However, here, instead of just having to worry about getting too close to the surface that will actually jump out, now we also have to worry about not getting too close to the bottom because there is no bottom and we'll just fall to our death. This gets especially difficult right near the checkpoint because we have some really thin bubbles to go through. In fact, it was so problematic that I just decided to let a bullet bill follow me so that way I could actually bounce off of it in order to skip a little bit of this. After that, we can grab the checkpoint, and the rest of the level actually isn't as bad because we can just stand on bill blasters most of the time. Nevertheless, I was able to beat this one, but it was not fun. But let's go ahead and move on to 7-3. For the most part, this level isn't too terrible, as we can use iframes to dodge the vast majority of fuzzies. However, once we land on these moving platforms, the bubble tracking gets a lot worse, which makes dodging the fuzzies quite a bit harder. However, while the first section is difficult and the second section is absolutely abysmal, it's not anything I can't handle. And the last section can just be entirely avoided by just going on the mushroom platforms below. 7-Tower is next, and it's actually one of the easiest levels in the game, and that's because we're given this motion control platform that allows us to tilt it back and forth. Now, this obviously moves it, but I don't care about that. What I care about is that gives us a controllable slope, which means we can actually slide controllably, which means we have a way of attacking enemies for once. And that actually means we can take up basically any threat that we face. Yes, even bullet bills, yes, even bonsai bills, and of course the bombs. After that, Ludwig goes down pretty easily, and we can just go ahead and crush 7- Ghost House. But we're not entirely out of the fog yet, as now we have 7-4. This level is actually kind of annoying because we have to use motion controls to control these platforms. Now, yes, I know I just said that motion controls made 7-Tower really easy, but that's because I was able to hold one controller horizontally for the vast majority of the level. Here, we still have to hold the remotes vertically with the Wii Dualies, which makes moving the platforms back and forth really annoying because of how far you have to tilt the remotes. But that's just what makes the level annoying, not really what makes it difficult. No, that comes from the very end of a level where we have to deal with a whole bunch of bullet bill spam. That is definitely not fun. But I was able to get past it with quite a few attempts, meaning we're able to move on to 7-5. This level brings back the second worst enemy in the entire game. Yep, it's got some Micro Goombas. But to be completely honest, because Micro Goombas, while yes, they're annoying, aren't that big of a threat, we can beat the level pretty easily. And the same can be said for 7-Castle, as while it has some giant skewers, since we have iframes, we can stall indefinitely inside of them, meaning it's not that hard of a level. However, then we reach World 8, and oh boy, this is where the real challenge begins. Before I hop into World 8, let me shed some light on how I've been ranking the difficulty of these levels. Now, I've either ranked them easy, medium, or absolute torture. Now, out of all the levels, I've only ranked 9 as absolute torture. And some of those include 1-Tower, 1-Castle, 3-4, 3-Castle, and 5-Tower. However, that's only 5 levels. And that's because the other 4 all take place in World 8. So yeah, this is gonna be a tough world, and it starts all off with World 8-1. This level has always been bad for my challenges, and it definitely is bad here. However, for once, it's not bad because of the meteors. Those are easy enough to avoid with iframes. However, the real problem comes from the platforming that we have to do. Normally, we're supposed to stand on top of these seesawing platforms, which we're supposed to platform across really quickly, but we can't do that because platforming quickly isn't in my vocabulary. Also, we have the problem of we can't really balance on these because I can't really hold the 1 button to move fast enough. Or can I? Now, due to how delicately we have to be able to move back and forth, full throttle is simply not an option for this section. But I do have another way of holding down the 1 button. That being by taking a twist tie, rolling it up, and then taping it down on top of the 1 button before strapping a rubber band on top of it. This will allow me to hold the 1 button. However, it really affects my speed, and it makes it a little bit disorienting after playing the whole game without the run button. Nevertheless, I was actually able to platform across these and make it all the way to the checkpoint, where the real level begins. This is the part of a level where the game realizes the errors of its ways. Because I still have hope, it needs to get rid of that, and it does it by completely removing these seesaw platforms, and instead replacing them with sinking platforms, which we have no way of stopping from falling directly into the lava. So yeah, we have to move quickly over them. Now, for the first few, we can just run on and fall off of them, and we should be able to make it with really precise twirls. However, then we get to the very last section. This section requires us to go between 2 sinking platforms that are pretty far apart, which is kind of a problem because we have to get the distance which can only be acquired by using a Luigi springboard, which is a problem in its own right because a Luigi springboard is very slow. At least we're not on a sinking platform heading straight to the lava. Oh wait, we are! And heck, we can't even set up really easily because there's also a poisonous fog that's been chasing us this whole level, and it really becomes a problem right here. Now, after several attempts, I was able to get a Luigi springboard, However, I also have to make sure that I bubble Luigi right after, as I need him in order to get enough distance to get to the mainland, which is also really far away. I don't know how I made it in the end, but I just barely got to the edge of the mainland by the skin of my teeth. After that, I got really lucky as some meteors actually broke the blocks heading to the secret exit, allowing me to actually get to the red pipe and allowing me to clear the level. Next up is 8-2, which is just a tad easier than 8-1, where all we really have to worry about are some spiky boulders and some enemies, where we can just avoid them by using the slopes to our advantage or by just using iframes from the bubbles. Other than that, nothing really poses a threat in this level, and we can move on to 8-3. Oh boy, welcome back to pain, as 8-3 certainly is difficult. Now, the first half isn't that bad, as the main gimmick are these lava waves and these chandeliers that dip into the lava once we stand on them. Now, this isn't that bad, as with some quick platforming we can get past the first couple, and for the second part we have some Koopas that we can bounce across instead, that sort of keep us in the air. And with a few attempts, I actually was able to clear the first half. But that's when the real level starts, because the second half is way more difficult. For the second half of the level, we start off with a couple of sections where we have to dip down pretty close to the lava. It's not that bad, because even if we die, we'll just respawn and be able to try again. But it's a little annoying. After that, we have a section with a sinking platform that I absolutely want to avoid because these things were terrible in 8-1. And I actually can avoid this one by setting up a Luigi springboard to bounce right over it. After that, we reach 3 more sinking platforms that we absolutely can't avoid with a Luigi springboard. But I can avoid it with a Luigi springboard onto a flame chomp that spawns. Now, it was a little tricky to get working because of how the flame chomp actually works, but I figured out its AI and I was able to get it into a good spot before bouncing off of it. After that, we have a couple more sinking platforms that are actually high enough that allow us to twirl to the other side if we're quick enough, so that's not as bad. Hopefully though, that's it with the sinking platforms, because I'm not sure how many more of these I can take. Anyway, now on to the next section, which is literally a sea of lava, only supported by sinking platforms. Yeah, unfortunately, unless I can fly horizontally, this ain't gonna happen. While we do have that infinite height trick from 5-Tower, it's not really applicable here, because in 5-Tower, not only were we going for vertical distance instead of horizontal distance, we were also in a tower or vertical level, which means the bubble was always moving directly upwards. Here, because we're in a horizontal level, what will happen is once we bubble a player, they'll actually do a small dip downwards, which means we're actually going to be losing height every time we bubble. This means the vertical height and horizontal distance required will never come from this bubble trick. Or at least that's what I would say if TAS wasn't a thing. With TAS, I don't really care what direction the bubble's initially going, because I can just go ahead and shake the remote at the right time to optimally send the bubble directly towards the other player. This definitely isn't going to be humanly possible because even the slightest problem will go ahead and send the entire plan plummeting down. However, by going ahead and timing everything perfectly, I can use a task to actually infinitely fly horizontally, which is perfect because that's just what I need to do to get past this huge lava sea. And with that, I was able to make it to the exit, meaning 8-3 is possible. But it doesn't get easier from here because now we have 8-Tower. This level is really annoying, and that's simply because the level itself is very long, and then we get to the hard part which we must clear before we get access to the checkpoint. This is annoying, because every time we fail the hard part, we have to go back and play the long level all over again. As for the hard part itself, it's a giant crushing section just like in 1-Tower, and oh boy, that brings back memories. Now, while it looks like there's a few safe spots marked with coins, while the first one is actually a legitimate safe spot, the other 2 aren't actually safe, as the first one will just end up crushing you, and the second one ends up receding into the wall. This means that we really only have one save point to get all the way up the section, and that really isn't a lot of space. However, by using Luigi springboards, we can actually get up to the second section, which gives us enough time to stall to get Luigi back to go all the way up. It's definitely not as easy as I just said, but I was actually able to do it. After the checkpoint, there's basically nothing before we get to Magic Koopa. We can quickly destroy them, and then we get to 8-4, which in my opinion was one of the hardest levels in the original Jumpless challenge, as oh no, I had to get out of the water. Yeah, now after doing this challenge, this level is a cakewalk. 8-5 similarly is a complete joke, as we can just stall on the left side of the screen and let the screen push us as we infinitely use the iframe trick. However, we're not free yet, as next up is 8-6. Do you remember the poisonous fog in 8-1 and how it was always following us? Yeah, what if we did that again, but like with lava in a vertical level? Welcome to 8-6, where we have to deal with rising lava, and yes, it's painful. And to be completely honest, I probably couldn't do some of the platforming here without some proper setups if it wasn't for the fact that the rubber band controller actually allows me to move much faster and get a lot more distance, which actually makes a lot of the jumps a lot easier. Which, combined with the fact that we have a bunch of trampolines in this first half, means we can actually make it to the checkpoint without too much difficulty. I mean, it's still difficult, but overall, compared to what we've had to do, I wouldn't consider it the worst thing. But hey, now we're in the second half, where the game reintroduces vines. Remember how I said they were a pain in 5-1, but at least we had enough time? Yeah, now we don't have enough time. However, I don't really need time, I need luck, as by getting lucky, I was actually able to get the perfect pop out of a bubble, and I was able to make it all the way up before reaching the end pipe. Now I should go ahead and mention that this was still a really hard level in its own right, simply because the bubble tracking here is absolute garbage, not only because it's a vertical level, but because of all the semi-solids. Now normally, when you're in a bubble and you reach the other player, if you're in the ground, you just get moved up, so you still get a decent amount of height. However, here, because semi-solids, the bubble will just pop underneath the semi-solid, meaning you'll lose a lot of your height and you might not be able to make it up several of the platforms. This makes this level kind of annoying, with everything else going on. Nevertheless, I did beat it, meaning we can move on to 8-airship. Welcome to the last easy level of the run. Now I use the word easy loosely because this is still a interesting level. And that's because in order to beat it, we are supposed to normally screw down some screws, which lower some platforms for us to platform on. However, these platforms are only available for a limited time only, so I actually have to platform really quickly, or I have to continuously hold down the screw. I decided to go with the latter option and hold down the screw permanently, and I did this by using feet strats. By going ahead and using two controllers for actual platforming and using the third controller with my foot to constantly shake it, feet strats are a real thing, and they allow me to beat 8-airship. Oh, also Bowser Jr. dies here, but he's pretty easy with iframe abuse, so there's not really much to talk about. With that, let's move on to the last and most difficult level in the entire run, 8-Castle. Now, what makes this level so hard? Well, let's talk about the first half. Now, for starters, it's a long section in its own right. However, when we get to the end, that's when it gets really difficult, as we have to make this jump across some sinking platforms. Now, for the first little jump, I went ahead and used some Luigi springboards. However, after that, we have to get some pretty good distance. Now, technically you could just run off, however, then the bubbled player wouldn't be able to make it to you before you fall into the lava. Instead, go ahead and let yourself sink down and then do a full throttle bounce. From there, bubble the other player immediately and try to get them over. If you're lucky, you'll make it to the red pipe. While you might think that this pipe will take me to the checkpoint, that's wishful thinking, as instead it takes me to this vertical auto-scroller where we have to survive as lava sinks below us. And of course, all we have at our disposal are sinking platforms. Now, you might be wondering how we're actually going to survive this, and my answer is good luck. My end strategy was essentially bouncing on Mario's head a whole bunch and just trying to maximize the amount of platforms I had to land on, which just maximized the amount of time that I was in the air. In the end, it did just barely work by the skin of my teeth, but with that, we enter the next red pipe and we are taken to the checkpoint. Now we have Bowser. After we enter the boss door, we end up in a hallway where we have to dodge Bowser's barrage of fire, which is not that bad because we have iframes on our side. However, then we fight Bowser himself, who actually is tangible even when we have iframes, which means we actually have to dodge him legitimately. This is kind of annoying, but we're able to get past him and hit the switch, which introduces us to Giga Bowser, the real challenge of this level. This fight is an absolute monstrosity, mostly because there's nowhere safe. Now your first idea might be, okay, so Bowser's here, go ahead and just survive by using iframes to get past his fire. However, that doesn't work because Bowser will actually move by doing giant claw swipes that take up half the screen. Okay, so just go really fast and try to dodge the fire that way. I can't do that because then Bowser will go ahead and do giant jumps, which aren't that big of a problem in the first half, but once you reach the second half, these jumps create shock waves where they actually shoot out a bunch of lava. This is a big problem because dodging lava ain't easy, and if you spend time to dodge, oh would you look at that, Bowser's right here and you're dead. After spending over 24 hours on this level, my best attempt had made it pretty close to the end. However, I just wasn't able to make the last push, as every time I fail, not only did I have to go through the hallway again and do the original Bowser fight and watch some cutscenes, but I also had to go through the entire first and second sections, and these take a long time, making this level especially tedious. So, no matter what I did, it just felt like the RNG was never on my side. However, I do have one way of nullifying the RNG, that being by making a task. Now, I really want to keep tasks out of this level because I do feel like it's humanly possible. However, just given the amount of time that I've spent on this level, I feel like I should send it off in a fitting destruction. And with tasks, even though Bowser lunged at me dozens of times, it was no match, and I can officially say that New Super Mario Bros. Wii can be beaten without power-ups and without jumping. But before I go, I do want to mention that with the powers of tasks, I was actually able to make a task of 8 Castle without touching the ground, which was the only impossible level in that challenge, meaning it's actually also possible to beat New Super Mario Bros. Wii without ever touching the ground. But with that, I would like to say, if you enjoyed this content, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. But with that, I would like to say thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Goodbye.